So, tēnā tātou katoa. He Pākehā aho e wehi o ko tukupuna o Waihangia piri tuna nui. Ko mihi ngaire te whare karikia no tamaki makauro Aotearoa aho. Ko Theresa taku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. So this is a very special traditional opening for someone who comes from New Zealand. It's what's referred to as being a mihi, which would be used by the New Zealand Māori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, at the beginning of a hui, which would be a very formal meeting or the meeting of minds. So as we've come together this weekend to talk about some really important issues around human potential and performance, it was important as an acknowledgement of my heritage and where I come from, just to share this little bit of my ancestry or my culture with you today. So you may have also seen, if you know anything about New Zealand, an image similar to this. So the traditional way to end a hui for New Zealand Māori is the pressing of noses, which is called a hongi, and a more informal way of saying hello is kia ora. So that is my one thing to teach you all today, is to be able to say kia ora. Go on, give it a go. Well done. So today, one of the things that I'm going to discuss with you is talking about the ketogenic diet and how I've used it to be able to progress my aspirations to compete as a bodybuilder, as a female figure athlete in New Zealand. I'm going to be sharing with you my journey, why I came to this and how I did it, and hoping that that's going to impart some wisdom for you. I'm sure that there's going to be some questions. I focus primarily around some of the nutrition, because the people that tend to reach out to me with questions is around some of that nutrition, but I'm really happy to talk about any of the other things that I've found have been really important as well. Obviously, the training is a huge component of what I do, but two of the other things that I think are really important facets of being successful in this arena is actually the community that's around you and your mindset as well. But today we'll be focusing mostly on the nutrition side of it. Okay, so where did it all begin for me? I'm incredibly lucky to have been born and raised in one of the most beautiful places in the world. New Zealand is really picturesque, and we're a very outdoorsy nation. We like to hunt and fish and hike and go camping, and being raised the eldest of 6 children, this was a part of my everyday life, and certainly something that my siblings and family really enjoy. But for me, being really active and doing a lot of exercise was not something that inspired me or that I spent a lot of time doing. I really, even in school, didn't play any sports at all. I actively avoided exercise altogether. It wasn't something that I really wanted to be participating in. Yet, like many women, I aspired to have the physique that I would see, lots of healthy and strong, fit women to have on social media and the accounts that I followed, or in perhaps the magazines that I was looking at. And I spent many years really trying to achieve this. I was a member of a gym for years and years and years in all the different places that we lived, and I would read lots of things online, and I would do everything that I thought I was reading how to do, how to train myself, and of course how to manage my food. What I know now, of course, is that what I was doing was really following more of a traditional bodybuilder's approach. I was eating lots of chicken and rice and broccoli, and that really wasn't working for me at all. So I thought, well, in order to get a different result, I'm going to have to do something differently. And so this is one of a couple of quotes that I'm going to share with you today. And one of the strategies that I've found throughout my particular journey, and in lots of things I've done in my life, is that I will often default to thinking about some kind of quote of inspiration when I'm finding things particularly difficult. That most often happens for me now when I'm working with my PT and I'm in a little bit of pain and it's getting a bit hard and I'm thinking, how am I going to get through this? There's always some kind of really memorable bit of inspiration that will come to me. And this is one of the things that I was thinking, well, I'm going to have to do something different. I haven't been successful on my own, so I'm going to have to step outside of my comfort zone and get some support. So the funny thing about selfies is that when you take them for yourself, you never envision that you're going to be flying to the other side of the world and sharing them in an audience like this. It's such a public forum. This one has never even been on Instagram. or the first one has. But this was my starting point. So at the beginning of 2016, at age 41, and I thought, I'm going to go and sign up for PT sessions with the hardest working trainer in my gym, who was a competitive bodybuilder himself in his early 20s, and I knew it was going to be hard work. But I was determined to do something different. So my starting point was around 52 kilos, around 30% body fat, and I'm only 5'2", so I'm not a very big person. But the decision to work with my trainer and get support with nutrition, he had a nutrition coach that he worked with who was supporting me with my diet at the time, was a really big turning point in achieving some of the success that I had for my goals. Very quickly I started to see some improvements, and I thought, oh great, I've hit the jackpot here, this is what I needed. I'm finally going to be able to achieve the physique that I wanted. And that worked for a little while, and I felt pretty good. But then after a little while, it wasn't working. And I'd always had some suspicions that perhaps I had some food sensitivities. I'd sort of had some mild GI issues, and bloating was something, for my tummy that, I never really could put my finger on what it was that I thought was affecting me. Typically, like a lot of people, I suspected gluten, and I did lots of experimentation around cutting certain foods out of my diet, and gluten was the one that I focused on the most. And then after a few months of working with them, my nutrition coach said to me, we had a bit of a stall, and she said, well, have you ever considered the ketogenic diet? And I didn't know anything about it at the time. And she explained to me that, this is going to be something that you'll only do for the short term. It might just turn things around, but perhaps you could give that a go. So I spent some time researching it and seeing what I could find out about it myself. And this was in late 2016. And so the middle picture was taken about 4 weeks into my ketogenic diet, and then this one only a short time later. And I was feeling an awful lot better, and I was seeing much, much, much quicker results. I think one of the things that I noticed the most is that I didn't know that I had brain fog until I didn't have it anymore. And I'd heard people talking about it as being a thing, and I thought, I wonder what that's like, those poor people. And then I realised that I'd had it for a really long time. So, and for me, it was one of those things that I just thought it was normal that when you would get to 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that you would be reaching for your 5th or 6th cup of coffee, and perhaps some chocolate to go alongside that so that you can get through the rest of the day. And at the time, I've been an early childhood teacher for all of my professional career, so I was working with big teams of teachers and lots of small children. That takes an awful lot of energy, as well as running the business alongside that. So energy and being able to think on my feet and work pretty quickly all the time was something that I needed to do a lot, and the ketogenic diet made a huge difference for me in my work as well. So I think by the time I got down to around here, I had dropped around to about 49 kilos, but I was still sort of in the mid to high 20s around the body fat. At the same time that I had been working with my nutrition coach and trainer through this period, they had also actively been encouraging me to consider competing. It was something that they knew that I had an interest in, just that I didn't have the confidence to be able to do it. And I was seeing some really good results in the gym, and so at the back of my mind, whereas I'd thought, perhaps I could give it a go, I really still didn't believe that I had what it took to do it. So by the time I got to the end of this year, and I had been doing keto up until Christmas, New Year period, and I thought, I've had really rapid results in this short space of time, maybe now is the time to commit to that. And I think probably the ketogenic diet was instrumental in my decision to actually commit to competing in the end. If I hadn't have done that, I'm really not sure that I would have ever done what I went on to do the following year. So this was my very first posing session in February of 2017. And so early on that year, and I thought, everything's come together. I've committed to doing a show. I was going to be competing in August. And I felt really excited about this impending journey. So by now I was 42. I was still terrified of the prospect of doing this, but I thought, at least if I don't have to focus on this, I'll just get through the prep in the meantime, and then I'll worry about actually getting on stage when the day comes. And so I'd committed to the date. I had my team around me, my trainer and my coach in place for my nutrition. And then in those early months, the wheels started to fall off. My nutrition coach moved to Australia, and my training buddy, who's currently sat in the front row of the audience, moved out of Auckland. We've forgiven her that though now. So, and I started to get really quite panicked. My training buddy was someone who was a big part of my community. We trained together 3 or 4 times a week with my trainer, and it meant in sharing those sessions that it was far more affordable for me to be able to do that. So my trainer rallied and got some other women who he was working with who wanted to increase their sessions in place so that I could carry on with the sessions that I needed, and I carried on. But it still left a gaping hole as to who was going to manage my food for me. At the same time as all of this was happening, everyone said to me, okay, you've got to stop this keto nonsense now. It's time to stop that. You know, you're feeling a lot better. If you're going to compete seriously, then you need to do it the proper way. You know, because there's only one proper right and way to do that. And I just thought, well, I just can't. I just feel so much better. There's got to be the possibility of my being able to do this. So anyone who knew at that stage that I had changed to a ketogenic way of eating, I just said to them, I'm going to take responsibility for this myself. I'm going to do it for myself, and if it doesn't work, then I've got no one to blame but myself. But I'm going to try because I feel so good, and I'm not prepared to sacrifice the way I'm feeling to give up to going back. Competing wasn't worth it for me to do that. So I carried on, and after many hours of trawling through the internet, I made 2 really, really important discoveries which turned out to be really significant turning points for me in that journey. The first is that I discovered podcasts. My husband and I went away on a tour of the South Island in New Zealand for a week, and he put on some podcasts, and I was like, tell me what these things are, and I searched through to see what was available, and I found The Ketogenic Athlete. And it had only been going for a very, very short period of time at that point. And I think I actually heard live the first interview where Danny was not the co-host at that time. And so I binge listened for the time that we were away and found a number of other podcasts, and that was it. I thought, I'm going to get enough help from this. The other discovery that I made along the way was Keto Savage and his YouTube channel, who also had a podcast. And so for the months that ensued followed after that, I would listen to absolutely every single bit of content that would come out of these 2 forums. And I spent many hours in front of my computer playing YouTube videos on repeat, pause, rewind, repeat to make sure that I had Robert's words correct, and I would do the same with the podcasts as well. And I went through screeds and screeds of notepaper as any information at all that they gave around what their macros were, and I would try and scale them down to what would fit a female ketogenic athlete who weighed less than 100 pounds. And that was not easy, but I was determined to do it. And so it was a little bit hit and miss. There was a lot of trial and error in that first year, but I managed to get my way through that. I'm just trying to work my notes here. So a little bit of an overview for the 2017 nutrition and how that worked in the first part of the year. So my calories started at around 2,000 at the beginning of that prep. And I think the one great thing that I got out of my original coach is that she told me, don't worry about the calories. We're not going to be counting those. Just keep your fat high, and just if you're hungry, you need to eat fat. And so it was well over 2,000 calories when I started. By the time I tapered down to my final weeks, just before I stepped on stage, my calories would easily have been as low as around 1,000 calories a day. For a very small person at that point, and I would have weighed, when I stepped on stage, I was 44.5 kilos. So I'm a very small person. But were the traditional ratios of around 75 to 80% fat and 15% protein, and my carbs were up to a maximum of 20 total carbs a day, and I've always counted total carbs as opposed to the net carbs as well. I found that a simple approach is really the best. So, in the early days, because I had only been keto at that stage for sort of 2 to 3 months, I did fall into a bit of a trap of wanting to try and replace some of the foods that I was missing with some of the keto baking that's available. I guess a lot of people will find themselves trawling Instagram or Pinterest, and you're looking at all these wonderful replacements that you can make that are meant to be keto-friendly recipes. I would really encourage you, if you're doing a prep or a cut, not to fall into the trap of wanting to replace some of those, because more than anything they end up becoming habits that actually sort of keep one foot in the camp of where you're still a carb eater. And when you transition into a ketogenic diet, it's not just a different way of eating, it is a different way of life and a different way of thinking about food. And I think when I finally made that connection, it was when it became easier for me to let go of some of those things that I was still missing. So I found that a really simple nutrition plan was best, and so I would typically eat a lot of the same foods, and it meant that if I knew what I didn't have to focus so much on what my calories were, and I was just getting my nutrition right every day, and I could really focus on my mindset and the training, and the fact that I was training twice a day, and I was up at 4 a.m. and still training at night. It was really long days to do the physical side of this as well. But if the food was simple, then I didn't have to put as much time into planning that in advance. Obviously, the issue of intermittent and extended fasting came up for me, and this was something that I wanted to know about. So again, I went back to my trusted podcasts and the books and the internet, and I found out as much information as I could and experimented with it. I did 1 3-day extended fast in this first period up to my first show that I did, and it was fine, but I would say in hindsight now that it's not something that I would recommend using as as part of your protocol for prepping for something like this. I think that it probably was detrimental to perhaps maintaining some of my muscle. I think there's a time and a place for fasting, but for me personally, I don't think that it was maybe the ideal thing for me to be using. I typically default now to a little bit more intermittent fasting, perhaps sort of a 16 or 20 hours a day fast, and eating one or 2 meals a day tended to be a little bit more successful. And so this was comp day, and I ended up being really fortunate in that I won my class, which was novice figure short, and then I also won the overall title, which was also quite a surprise, but obviously I was extremely happy to have done that. So I weighed 44.5 kilos on comp day. By skinfold test, my body fat was put just under 10%, which I think is probably a little bit light. I think it was actually probably higher than that. If I'd had a more accurate measure of it, I think it probably would have been higher. But regardless, I couldn't have been happier with the results. And it wasn't just about the fact that I came away with trophies in hand. It was to have overcome so many personal hurdles at that stage, and so many things that had been put in my way, and so many people who said that it couldn't be done. And so it was definitely on a little bit of a high. And in this moment, you know, every early morning alarm and every lunge, every squat, every deadlift, every meal prepped was absolutely and completely worth it, you know, to have stood on the stage and to have done so well, and to know that I had done it primarily on my own, apart from that support with my PT, but to have learnt how to manage that nutrition and put it together was really quite an empowering feeling. So I did go on to compete again in 2017, so having done so well in the first competition, I ended up qualifying for Nationals, which was held at the end of October. So between the first competition in August and this one, I went away to Vietnam for a couple of weeks and probably ate a little bit more than I should have done. It was absolutely worth it as well. And then when I came back and I got in touch with Robert and I asked him to coach me for that last sort of 4 or 5 weeks into Nationals, just so that I could be a little bit more hands-off. And as a type A personality who's a little bit of a control freak, that was a really difficult thing for me to do, but hands down the best thing that I could have done, because I learned a huge amount from that process. And I think, it was even things like how to actually just really make sure that I was keeping track of all the data that I needed, so that we had really sound information for any of the tweaks and changes that we were doing. And it was a huge learning curve for me, but it was great for me to be able to take some of that pressure off. I say one of the things that I think some competitors are at risk of doing for themselves when you're managing your own training protocol is that you don't see the scale moving, or perhaps you don't see the results that you expect to see, and there's always the risk that you're going to put yourself into a bit of a panic mode and start slashing calories or making decisions that might not be in your best interests. So having that hands-off approach and having a bit of a break was a really good opportunity. So I didn't place in this particular competition. These fabulous women here all had 2 to 3 years experience on me, and Krista in the turquoise there came first. She's wonderful. But it was just fantastic to be in my first year within 8 months of starting bodybuilding, to be actually standing on stage with the top 100 athletes in New Zealand, which was fantastic. So in 2018, so I've gone on, and 3 weeks ago today I did my third competition, and these are the photos from that night. I came away with 3 more trophies, 2 seconds and a third. But I took quite a different approach to my macros this year, and I decided to do a little bit more experimentation and just see what else could be done. The reason that I chose to do that is I had a few concerns from the previous year, and I wondered whether or not I had, because in some of my on some of the feedback that I got is that I was incredibly lean. I was very striated through some of my shoulders, and some of the judges had suggested that perhaps a fuller look would have been great as well. And so I wondered whether or not, you know, I could manipulate some of the food to be able to achieve some of that. I had also at that point joined the Ketovangelist Unlimited group, and there was a cut going on at that point, an experiment in the January, and Danny was leading that around manipulating fat as opposed to protein. And I was sort of doing a little bit of my own research online as well, and I came across some other information, and I heard some others, Chris Irvin, I think, also being interviewed, where he talks about keeping protein a bit higher and manipulating the fat. So I wanted to experiment with some of that for myself to find out whether or not that was going to work. So my calories started again at around 2,000, and the lowest on some of those weeks did definitely get lower than they did the previous year. What was the difference though is that the actual grams of protein is significantly higher in some of that, but I did it in 3 phases. So the first phase, in the first sort of 8 weeks or so of this period, was traditional keto macros with fat at around the 75 to 80%. And I slowly started tapering the fat, and I just maintained the protein at a stable level, which obviously started to shift the balance of those. Through the middle period, it was more around sort of a 1-to-1 ratio of protein and fat. And then in the latter part, in the third phase of what I was doing, the protein was very high. And in some weeks where I was eating lower calories, my protein would have been anywhere between 150 and 170 grams a day, which was extremely high for me. In the previous year when I had done it, some of the lowest days for my protein would have been around 35 to 40 grams of protein, just to illustrate some of the differences of what I've done. I found that there was probably definitely an adaptation period in doing that. The first couple of weeks where protein was higher, I don't think I felt as lively as I would normally have done, but that passed after the first 2 weeks, and then it was fine. I didn't see any differences in what I was achieving in the gym with some of my lifts, and I definitely had enough energy to maintain getting through some of my calories. I find that one of the things that I'll do is vary macros a little bit from day to day. So I might have had some days during a week where calories might be higher, up to say 1,000 or 1,200 calories, and that might have been on a leg day or preceding a leg day, and then I might have had a couple of days where they were lower. Sometimes undulating my calories in that day, I found kept my body guessing a little bit, and I had more satiation and less thinking about food in between meals. I didn't feel quite as hungry as some occasions where I had done the previous year. One of the other things that I'd also done is between the first 2 competitions in 2017 is I had also transitioned to following a carnivore keto way of eating. And I decided to do that for a couple of reasons. Some of my GI distress that I had always suffered from, and some of that bloating had continued despite a ketogenic diet as well. And while I initially thought that the concept of a carnivore keto way of eating seemed really, really strange, I wanted to give it a try anyway, and it has been fantastic for me. I keep trying to reintroduce plants in some format or another, and every time I do, within a matter of hours, I can look very, very swollen, and it can take 3, 4, or 5 days for that swelling to go down. It's not painful for me, but it's just very, very uncomfortable. So some of these very low days where calories might have been around that 900 mark, I guess I was following what would be called PSMF, or a protein sparing modified fast protocol. And so that is the very higher protein with much, much lower fat. I was really concerned about how I was going to respond to that and whether or not I was going to have energy because, you know, I loved the ketogenic way of eating, but I still wasn't eating carbs. So I didn't see any significant change in my blood glucose levels. They raised a couple of, points, in terms of 0.1, 0.2, 3 points. And ketones stayed a fraction lower, but again, not significant changes. And I kept with the same intermittent fasting protocols as I had done the previous year as well. So using 1 to 2 meals a day and fasting for between 16 and 20 hours. So I've had some regular DEXA scans throughout the process as well, just to illustrate some of those changes to track some of what was happening. So from start to finish, the first DEXA scan was taken 3 weeks before the Nationals competition, and you can see there's not a significant change in weight between October and May, this being my stage weight just 3 weeks ago. But the lean mass, obviously, it's actually in what was such a short period of time to actually see some gains in that, I think, is actually really reaffirming. And body fat ended up being lower. I think I only had 11 weeks off where I guess I was not in prep between the second competition and competing this year. So I'm really hopeful that I'm going to be able to put on significantly more muscle moving forward and have a much, much better off-season. 11 weeks is, in hindsight, not an ideal situation and probably not something that I would recommend that someone would do. But I was determined to be able to try and fit in one more competition if I could before I was coming to KetoCon this year. If nothing else but the data. So some of my conclusions. I think it's possible to change your macro ratios depending on what your individual goals are. One of the things that I would say though is that I really wouldn't recommend that someone would do that very, very early on in your journey. If I hadn't have been strict keto at traditional, what would I guess be called therapeutic ratios in that first 12 months, I don't think this year would have been as successful as it was for me. And my personal feeling is that I'm now going to be reversing out of what I've just done. And I think for me that maintaining a higher fat ratio, perhaps not as high as I was, around the 70 to 80%, might be something under that, but that's going to be my next thing to work out. But I don't think that it has to be as high as it was for me to be able to achieve what I need. Also that there does seem to be an awful lot of fear around protein for people in the ketogenic community as well, and lots of questions around gluconeogenesis and am I going to lose my muscle? I don't think that the higher protein is to be feared. I definitely found that I was able to maintain a fuller look, and I did get some great feedback around that this year. It's hard to know exactly what that's attributed to, but it does seem that the approach that I used worked for what I was trying to achieve. So it's definitely possible that you can manipulate the fat, but you're not going to know for yourself as an individual until you try. And more than anything, because people are starting to reach out for me for some support, I wanted to be able to feel that I had at least tried it myself rather than to dismiss it as being something that wasn't going to work. If someone had said to me 18 months, 2 years ago that I was going to eat a predominantly fat-based diet, or that I was going to eat only meat and cut all plants out of my diet, or that I was going to step on stage, I would have thought that they were crazy. Yet here we are talking about this very thing. So sometimes, keeping an open mind and just sitting on an idea and digesting it for a little while can be a great thing to do, and then make a decision based on your individual needs. So this one is one of my favourite quotes of all time, and I've used this one a lot in my lifetime, but most people don't recognise opportunity when they see it because it is dressed up in overalls and it looks like hard work. Competing really is hard. It's a very long period of time to do a cut and to work towards a goal like that. And regardless of whether or not you want to do bodybuilding or you want to step on stage, this applies, perhaps to just doing a cut for yourself, or whether or not you want to do anything else. But I think putting in the effort and learning about something that, particularly if it's played on your mind for a long time, is really worth doing it. And I think as individuals, it's I think fantastic to be empowered and to be autonomous enough to be able to go out and find that information and to be able to do it for yourself. We can be citizen scientists, as Brian is always talking about doing, and take control of these things for ourselves. And once you've done this, I think being a ketogenic person and following this way of eating is that starts to play into other areas in your life as well. So I'm having some conversations with my GP at the moment around cholesterol levels and some of those things as well. And it's great being able to be autonomous in that if you've actually learned that information yourself. So one of the last things that I was just going to point out is that, the bigger picture is that within OECD levels and ratings of obesity ratings, although the United States is sitting apparently at number 1, New Zealand is very close behind in place 3. So we're a nation of only 4.5 million people, but this is something that really concerns me. And I think that's one of the things that the ketogenic way of eating has given me, as it's become the ketogenic way of life. And I'm really inspired now to actually help a lot of people, but particularly coming with that education background, we have really, really high rates of childhood obesity in New Zealand, and I'm quite concerned about that next generation. And I think one of the things that we all have the opportunity to do is, while we're here learning about what we can do for ourselves, is there's probably one other person in our life who we can share some information with when we go home as well, for not just helping us in what we can achieve with our own goals, but how we might be able to help somebody else as well. So those were some of the main points that I wanted to share with you today. We've probably only got about 5 or 6 minutes left, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. See, covered everything.
I'm getting questions.
I knew you would, Robert. Thank you.
So can you talk about was there much cognition difference between the higher protein and higher fat ratio as calories dropped? Was there any change there?
That's a really good question. I think it was one of the things that I noticed a little bit just in that first 2-week period, where I definitely noticed there was a bit of an adaptation, and I thought, I don't feel as high energy as I would normally have done, but it passed after that first 2 weeks and I went back to feeling completely as I had done previously. So I do put that down to making the change, because obviously my body was used to having less protein, but I did taper that protein up quite slowly. I didn't sort of go from 50 grams to 150 overnight, and I did it sort of intermittent days as well, but I definitely noticed a difference.
I really like what you said about you don't think you would have responded as well to high protein if you hadn't been that fat adapted initially. I think that's the mistake I see a lot of people make, is they don't give their body the chance to get fat adapted prior to doing the higher protein. Their body's not able to utilize that higher protein efficiently.
Yep, I agree. And there was, I think it might have been Sean Wells in his talk yesterday was talking about the fact that once you have built more muscle on your frame and that you have more lean body mass, that your capacity for consuming higher grams of protein in your diet, that you have a better ability to be able to do that, and that you potentially need it to be able to maintain some of that muscle mass. He was theorising around some of that. So perhaps that's why, and it's one of why I had made the assumption that I think it's better that you do the higher fat ratio for quite some period of time before you would experiment with something like that.
You get more jacked every time I see you, Theresa.
Yeah. Thanks.
We got another question. You got one?
Oh, sure. Awesome. I think unless you want to keep
No. I want to share the microphone.
Other than obviously dropping calories as you come up to a show, do you mess with your macros at all, or do you add or deplete salt, or what's your last couple of weeks leading up to a show look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, all of the things that Robert talked about in his previous session apply. The same thing happens for me. So I will do a caloric refeed the night before, say stepping on stage the next day. You know, my favourite thing that I like to eat the night before a show is a fathead pizza. I really look forward to that, and it's got anchovies in it, and it's got lots of salt. I make it because I do have that GI distress, and I respond really badly to anything that's got high fibre, so I can't eat the miracle rice. So I will, my newest recipe that I use for my base is with tuna and ground pork rinds. That makes a great base. But yes, so I do play around with the macros a little bit, but again, it depends entirely on how my body was responding at the time. Yeah.
And you don't like manipulate salt or anything? You just kind of keep that exactly the same?
No. Salt goes much higher with that meal. So the anchovies and the salt and everything else that goes on it, so it's got bacon and things that's got lots of salt in it. Yeah. Yeah.
So all like the keto, like everything that everybody wants to hashtag keto.
Yes. Yes.
Is in your pizza.
Yes, definitely.
Gotcha. But other than that, you just drop till like the night before you have your almost your cheap the day before.
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And exactly the same on comp day as well. You know, I'm sipping on water all day. I have my fat bombs there. I don't eat an awful lot on comp day, but it just depends on what we need. So the idea for me, because prejudging everything is done in the morning, so I've got to look better for that than I do the night show. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Right. You're welcome.
Hi, would you mind talking a bit more about the protein-sparing modified fast? I know that traditionally with the Lyle McDonald method, he actually has a carb refeed, I think. Did you do any of that? I'm presuming not.
No.
No. How low did your fat actually go, and what was your general experience of that? Because most people seem to find it pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, I know, and I was expecting, because I'd read lots of things that, you know, perhaps potentially, you know, I knew I was taking a risk and that perhaps I would feel really awful, but I didn't. The lowest that my fat got on some of those days was perhaps around 30 grams a day, so it wasn't very high at all. The one thing that I enjoyed about it is that I had a greater variety of some of the protein sources that I was eating. So I was eating some chicken, and I eat a lot of seafood anyway, but I was eating a lot more white fish. But I also eat a lot of organ meat as well. Like, I really like liver. And I did have a lot of that. So there was an awful lot of micronutrients still coming in. I was watching that very carefully.
Lately, I've been thinking about the recovery aspect of keto. Mm-hmm. Before keto, you have a leg day, and then you can't sit or stand very well for about 3 or 4 days.
Yes.
Keto, our hunger changes. We don't respond the same to hunger like we used to. Thirst is different. The recovery, what I've been thinking about lately is I don't get sore the same.
Yeah.
So I lift weights 5 times a week. I rock climb, I run, I play soccer, but I don't feel that same soreness I used to. But also, how do you stop yourself from overdoing it if there is a thing? If you get my meaning. Because I feel like I can just kind of
keep
run
going
all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that as well. I think before keto, if I was doing a leg day and my trainer, pushes me really hard, but legs is something that he really enjoys, and he makes no differentiation between the men and the women that he trains. So, I previously, it would take me days, easily 3 or 4 days to recover on a standard bodybuilder's approach with, after a leg day. But I don't find that with keto at all. I could very easily do a leg day again the next day on keto. And I think that you just have to have an awareness of tracking yourself and how good you feel. If I'm still sleeping really well, if I'm still getting through the day, and I'm not losing my patience with people that I interact with, and I'm feeling okay, then I'm guessing that I'm getting enough recovery time in. I will have a day off during the week where I won't train, or I'll do maybe just some light cardio to make sure I get that in. But I do have the new Aura Ring on order, and I'm looking forward to receiving that so that I can actually start using some of that information as well. It hasn't shipped yet though.
All right, you didn't talk about this at all in your presentation, so I don't want to steal your thunder or anything. But
right.
if you're willing, I'd love for you to talk about what you've talked to me about with regard to your future plans now that you feel so convicted in this lifestyle.
I knew you'd say that. In terms of what I'm doing when I get home, or
just big picture, like general, like the big steps that you both have done.
Have taken. Yeah, the ketogenic way of life, as I refer to it now, it's so much more than just a way of eating. It really has completely changed everything for me. When I stumbled across this, I'd gone through a huge personal a change in my profession, and I didn't come out of that feeling fantastic about myself. And I probably could have gone and support, got some serious support around that, but instead I fell into this space where I ended up finding keto and training, and that kind of consumed me, and I think that saved me in a lot of ways. But I've become really inspired about this, and I really want to start working in this space and to be able to empower other people to feel autonomous, to be able to take care of their charge of their own health as well. So some of the things that that we've done at home recently is we've sold our house and downsized, and we are looking to start some businesses. I'm currently working with someone at home around space for opening my own gym, among some other things that we're working on. I've also started a postgraduate study in holistic performance nutrition, which advocates for a low-carb approach and working primarily with athletes, but you can work with anyone on that space. And so it's really something that I'm quite committed to, and has just basically come into my entire life.
Proud of you, Theresa. Proud of you.
Thanks, Robert. It's my number one supporter. Okay. That's it, guys, then. Thanks for listening.